I'm Christopher Lowen, and this is Behind the Sermon, the podcast all about the art of preaching, from those very first ideas to late nights and early mornings spent at work, from practice, all the way to the moment of truth. This show pulls back the curtain on the rocky and beautiful and terrifying and beautiful and memorable work of creating the unique event in time known as the sermon. Behind the Sermon always features a recent sermon that I have preached, audio, or now, as it happens, video, because we're putting these podcast episodes out on YouTube as well as through all the major podcast suppliers. But you'll get to hear a sermon that I preached this week on Mount Tabor and the Mount of Transfiguration, where here at the Redlands Adventist Church in beautiful Southern California, where I have the privilege and honor of serving as the lead pastor. And, as always, of course, I'll share with you my candid reflections on the good and the bad and the many things that were overlooked and left out along the way. So, thanks for joining me as always, folks. I believe we're on episode number 28, which is remarkable to me. I'm excited that I got to be, this thing is carrying on. We've been doing it for, I think, a little over a year, which is great. So we're just, pushing right through. 28 of them in a year. I don't feel like it's too bad. That's every other week at least. So we're just going to keep doing it. We're going to keep making it through. And we'll keep improving. But this week, like I mentioned, we're preaching a sermon on mountains and valleys. This Mountains and Valleys series, and it's metaphorical mountains and metaphorical valleys, and also literal mountains and literal valleys. So we're looking at stories about mountains and valleys in the Bible, and asking what they have to teach us about the ups and downs of life, from fears to doubts to conflict to all the different things. And, this particular week is the first week we were in the New Testament. All the other ones so far have been in the Old Testament. We finally made our way to the New Testament, and we're looking at this story that is very, very familiar to some Christians, but then, is maybe less familiar to others. And I come from a tribe, a spiritual tribe and a community for whom the story of the Transfiguration is not one that's told super frequently. And I actually kind of talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the sermon, sort of mentioned that, there's a lot of branches of Christianity for whom, the feast of the Transfiguration, the story of the Transfiguration is just absolutely huge. And yet, in my tribe, it's not one that sticks out a whole lot. It's not one that we talk about. And so we were looking at the Mount of Transfiguration, the story about Jesus, and this kind of mystical theophany experience where the disciples felt like they were near and very close to God, and they saw Elijah and they saw Moses, and it was this crazy thing on a mountain. And then we use that to kind of as a diving board to make comments about faith and the nature of faith and doubt, and how we all come to answer that question: who do you say Jesus is? And for me, that kind of the main point that I was driving at is really that question: who do you say Jesus is? And I actually kind of liked it at the end. I'll get more to this later, but really driving at the question, how does the way that you live your life answer that question? Because that's kind of what Jesus gets at on the Mount of Transfiguration, at least the passages surrounding it. And then secondarily, are there ways that you ought to live your life differently because of those claims about Jesus and his identity? So if you say yes, sort of answer like Peter, yes, Jesus is the Christ. Well, that has implications on how we would live our life now. We would be more generous, for example, or that we would be more willing to forgive, or we'd be more loving and empathetic, or that we would be more courageous about taking a stand for Jesus, maybe, or for sharing our own experience with someone else that might be hard to do. So kind of the closing emotion that I wanted to leave. So in this opening segment, I always like to share, kind of where we're headed, where we're going. And so that's sort of the main point that I was driving at. But what I wanted to leave folks with there at the end of the sermon was to kind of leave them with the idea of almost like an altar call. Like I wanted to leave them with a, sort of the leaving emotion of make a commitment, make a choice, make a decision, or whatever it happens to be. Like maybe that decision or that choice is to study more, or it's to work more on this, or it's to, get into the Bible or find a Bible study group or something, or maybe it's to make a commitment. Maybe you've never made a commitment before. Maybe it's to get baptized finally after all these years you've thought about it. Whatever it is, I wanted to push people towards sort of an altar call. And of course, this sermon took place via Zoom, and so it was going to be a digital altar call, and that's kind of how it works sometimes. But so that was kind of the leading emotion. So there's where we're going with the sermon. That's the context. That's what this thing is all about. Context is everything. That's what was trying to happen here, and So now I want to give you a recording of that sermon. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to hear and see the video of it. And if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts, you will be able to listen to it. And it's about 28 minutes long, which I must say I'm pretty pleased with. I know that if you've listened to the show very often, I complain to myself regularly about the sermon length and getting it down. And I'm not anywhere near the Catholic priest homily length or that kind of thing, but we're not in the 19th century 90-minute sermon range either. So anyway, so 28 minutes long. If you've already heard it, you don't want to listen to it again, go ahead and bounce forward as soon as I stop talking. Bounce forward 28 minutes, and we will catch you on the other side. Thanks for joining us, folks. Good morning, church. It's good to be with you, even if on Zoom. I'm here in my office. Pastor Todd is just over the way, and Marco is here as well. But it's good to be with you. Happy Sabbath. I hope that you are hanging in there. Some of you maybe have seen, I'm going to kind of cut the intro stuff short this week. We've been putting out a weekly pastor's update video. It goes out with the weekly email. It's on the website. It's on social media. So I encourage you to take a look at that and just to kind of get the latest of what's happening, at least from the perspective of this particular pastor. But we are in a sermon series on mountains and valleys right now. And we're looking at metaphorical mountains, and we're looking at literal mountains, both. We're looking at the mountains and the valleys that we travel through as a part of our lives. And we're also looking at literal mountains, actual stories of mountains in the Bible and what they can teach us about things like loss and change and difficulty and conflict and fear. And so far we've been on Mount Nebo and Mount Carmel, not Caramel, Mount Sinai, Mount Ararat, all sorts of different places. And today we are turning our eyes to the New Testament for the first time in our series, and we're looking at what's known as the Mount of Transfiguration. And many people believe and teach that the actual mountain is Mount Tabor, but our theme for this week is just as Brian said, it's about faith and doubt. And so this week, what I want to do is something similar to what we did last week, which is I just want to read through some of the text and make some observations about it. I'm going to, the story of the Mount of Transfiguration, it actually shows up in 3 different spots in the New Testament. It's in Matthew 17, and Luke 9 and Mark 9. And as it turns out, each of those accounts are remarkably similar. And so we're going to look at the Luke account today, and I just want to read it to you, just so we're kind of all on the same page of what we're talking about when we're talking about the Transfiguration. So this is Luke chapter 9, and I'm going to read from verse 28. And I'm just going to read it as it is here, and then we're going to make some observations. All right? Sound good? All right, I got the bully pulpit here, so even if it doesn't sound good, that's what we're going to do. So about 8 days after saying this, he climbed to the mountain to pray, taking Peter, James, and John along. While he was in prayer, the appearance of Jesus' face and his clothes became blinding white. At once, 2 men were there talking with him. They turned out to be Moses and Elijah. And what a glorious appearance they made. They talked over his exodus, the one Jesus was about to complete in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Peter, with those with him, were slumped over in sleep. When they came to, rubbing their eyes, they saw Jesus in his glory and the two men standing with him. When Moses and Elijah had left, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, this is a great moment. Let's build 3 memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He blurted it out without thinking. While Peter was babbling on like this, a radiant cloud enveloped all of them, and they found themselves buried in a cloud. They became deeply aware of God's presence. Then there was a voice that came out of the cloud. "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." Wow. What an incredible story, and maybe kind of confusing story. Maybe for some of you who are listening in today, you've heard about or heard this phrase, the Mount of Transfiguration, or the Transfiguration of Jesus, and you've thought to yourself, man, what even is that? I sort of heard it, but I don't even know what that's about, or what's the big deal. You know, I know that in the Catholic world and in the Orthodox world and in the Anglican world, the Transfiguration seems to be a much bigger deal than it seems to be in a lot of segments of Protestantism. In fact, there's even a feast of Transfiguration. But of course, in the Adventist tradition, it doesn't seem like we have so much. And I don't really know what the reason for that is, but it's just not a huge emphasis. I don't frequently hear preachers preach on it in the Adventist tribe. And, you know, I don't know if it has to do with theology or this kind of weird thing where there's these people that are dead that are there. And, you know, I don't really know what the reason is. It's kind of a mystical thing. You know, the theological term for what takes place on the Mount of Transfigurations on the Mount of Transfiguration is theophany. Theophany. It's a visible manifestation of God to humanity. Now, if we read the commentaries, if you read commentaries about this text, almost all of them will highlight parallels between Moses' experience on Mount Sinai and what happens here to Jesus. And in fact, there's at least 6 or 7 different parallels, and I'm going to write them down here. We have them on the screen as well. But first, there's a 6-day interval before all this happened, right? There's a 6-day interval prior. If you read back in Matthew 17 or Luke 9 or Mark 9, there's a 6-day interval, and then God speaks on the 7th day. He says his thing. Moses, a parallel. This is kind of a funny one. Moses is present at both of these situations. Both of them take place on a high mountain. A cloud covers that mountain. Their face or their clothes, or both, are shrouded in light, or they shine with light. The disciples, I learned how to spell there. The disciples are terrified; they're afraid in the story in the New Testament, and of course, the Israelites are afraid when Moses comes down the mountain in the story of Moses going up on Sinai. And of course, they each end with a declaration where God declares, "This is who this person is. Listen to him." And in this case, God is saying something significant about Jesus. You know, the reason that this is a parallel passage, the reason that we get it, the reason and what the authors are trying to do and why this whole thing happened, it's a demonstration of Jesus' identity as God's messenger. One of my favorite theologians, N.T. Wright, writes about this passage and says, if you want to find the way to God, if you want to find the way to the promised land, you must listen to him. That the transfiguration and the experience on Sinai, both of these parallel experiences, they were a way for God to say to his people, listen to my messenger. If you want to get to that promised land that Brian just talked about in his testimony, if you want to get there, listen to Jesus. Another theologian, William Lane, writes about this passage. When the cloud lifted, Moses and Elijah had vanished. Jesus alone remained as the sole bearer of God's new revelation to be disclosed through the cross and his resurrection. And that's the question for us today. It's all about identity. It's what this passage is about. It's all about identity. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who do you say that Jesus is? That's what the transfiguration is all about. It's about who Jesus is. In fact, the Greek word transfiguration, the Greek word that's translated there, I'm not going to write it on here, is the Greek word metamorphosis. It's actually metamorpheo, or I can't pronounce it exactly right, but it's the word where we get from English metamorphosis. It's the same word as transfiguration. It kind of conjures this idea of making a change, of going from immature to mature. At least for me, when I hear the word metamorphosis, I think of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. We, of course, see this in our kids. We see transfiguration. We see their everything about them change. Some of you saw the little video I posted on social media this week of Finn doing his cello recital. And, I was thinking back about when he started. He started playing cello 3 years ago. And so I went back and found one of the first pictures of him with his first cello. He's now 2 cellos beyond that very first little tiny one that he had. And this picture that you're seeing on the right, that was his very first lesson. He sat there, he didn't even get to hold the bow. He just got to hold the cello, just to learn how to hold it. And what a crazy transfiguration or metamorphosis that Finn has gone through. And of course, all of our kids go through it. We see that in our own lives. We all grow and change and shift. And so I have a question for you. Of course, this question is, or this story is driving at who do you say Jesus is? But to me, when I read this story and I hear it called the Transfiguration, I wonder to myself, who really was transformed like that? Did Jesus really change? Did he totally change in that moment? I kind of wonder to myself if the transfiguration, if the change, if the metamorphosis that took place that day was more about the disciples, Peter, James, and John, and their ability to see. I wonder if they saw who Jesus was all along the way. And so that's the question for us today. Who do we see Jesus as? And maybe for you, you need some new eyes to sort of figure and sort that out. I don't know. But that's our first observation and our first question for today. Second observation from the passage. We're going to go backward a little bit in the passage. And in all 3 accounts, in Matthew chapter 17 and in Mark chapter 9 and in Luke chapter 9, in all 3 of them, they have a passage that takes place just before the Transfiguration, where Peter talks and kind of declares his belief in who Jesus is. In fact, it's Peter answering this question: who is Jesus? What is Jesus' identity? What is he doing? What's he all about? Peter answers that, and he says, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Each one of these accounts about the Transfiguration, they begin with this common element of Peter just prior declaring who Jesus is. And in fact, there are a number of similarities that we see just prior. There's the feeding of crowds. There's a warning of yeast of the Pharisees. There's Jesus predicting his own death. There's the Transfiguration. And they all end, after the Transfiguration is over, they all end with the healing of a demon-possessed boy. But like I said, I want to draw your attention to Peter naming Jesus as Messiah. And, I think sometimes there's a risk here where people, preachers maybe sometimes preach on the transfiguration and they make it all about Peter, which is kind of, I think, a little bit of a mistake. The passage is a theophany. It's Jesus revealing himself. And, if we said, as we said earlier, that the reason for the transfiguration was about Jesus' identity and helping his disciples see and know who he was, then a cursory look at this passage would lead us to conclude that at least for one of those disciples, the transfiguration wasn't necessary because Peter already knew. Peter already had made that declaration. He had already, and maybe even James and John already believed and knew. It makes me wonder then, who is the transfiguration story for? If Peter already was clear on it, and maybe the two other disciples that were there, if they were already clear on it, then why this moment? Why this transfiguration? Why this declaration about Jesus' identity? Why? Well, I think it was for all the other disciples. It's for the disciples that are still living today. It's for you and me. Peter, later in his life, writes in one of his letters about this experience. He writes, "We weren't, just wishing on a star when we laid the facts." This is 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. "We weren't just wishing on a star when we laid the facts out before you regarding the powerful return of our Master Jesus Christ. We were there for the preview," he writes. "We saw it with our own eyes, Jesus resplendent with light from God the Father, and the voice of the majestic glory spoke, 'This is my Son, marked by love, focus of all my delight.' We were there on that holy mountain with him, and we heard the voice out of heaven with our own ears." We live in a faith community, and we live in a wider community where there are all sorts of different answers to this question: who is Jesus? Peter was at one place, and then maybe James and John were kind of at a similar place, but maybe they weren't quite there. And then all the other disciples, they didn't get to take part in this experience. They only got to hear about it. And then there's all of us. We live in a community where people are in all different phases of faith. Some people are right at the beginning. They're asking all sorts of questions, trying to figure things out. Some people have a little bit of clarity, but they're moving forward. We live in a community that is in all different places of faith. And in fact, we did a sermon series earlier this year before the pandemic. Well, sort of as the pandemic was hitting, but we did a sermon series called "We Are Family," and it's all about how being a family of faith is we're diverse and we're in different places, and we make space for one another, and we look out for one another, and we're inclusive of the fact that we are different in many different ways. We hold Jesus in common, but we're in all different places. Our faiths grow at different speeds. And, I think that when we think about kids and teenagers and, as they mature through life, it's maybe a little bit more simple to see that. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult to see it in adults. But we kind of see phases of faith that people go from. But, we all are in different spots. If you're a teenager, it's normal to ask difficult questions about faith and to think and to ask, why is this not working? Or why does this answer not make sense? And it makes sense if we've been a part of the church and have been following Jesus for many, many decades to want comfort and healing and assurance. It's normal. We're in different places. The challenge for us, the challenge for a community of faith is can we make space for people who answer that question in different ways and who are all on the same track, moving the same direction? I have to tell you, for me, that's the most exciting thing about being a pastor. It's the greatest challenge, perhaps, but it's the thing that makes me get up in the morning. I love this challenge of making space for people who answered these questions differently, who are in different spots. And how can we go along all together and make it work for everyone? So, two observations from the text today, right? This text is about, the transfiguration is about Jesus' identity. And that this transfiguration experience happens to a group of people who are in community and who answer that question differently. Now, the third observation from the text. The third observation from the text. In every single version of this story, in all three, Matthew 17, Luke 9, Mark 9, in all three versions, Jesus concludes to his disciples after it's all over, and I didn't read it before, so I'll just read it here. He tells them, do not talk about this. In the Luke version, it doesn't give the exact quote. It just says he told them. He says they were speechless, and they continued to be speechless, and they did not say one thing to anyone during those days. Jesus tells them to keep it secret. Keep it secret. Now, there's lots of possible reasons why Jesus might have done this, and we're not told exactly why in the story. In other places we hear Jesus sort of talk about, sort of thinking about the arc of his life. And of course, in each of these three accounts of the Transfiguration, Jesus predicts his own death. So maybe he's thinking about the arc of his life and what's coming next, and he doesn't want to get short-circuited of what's planned ahead. But I think it's possible that one of the reasons Jesus told the disciples, listen, don't talk about this theophany. Don't talk about this mystical experience. Don't talk about the way that you see anew, the way that this transfiguration, don't talk. I think it's possible that Jesus told them not to talk about it because he wanted their lives to do the talking. It's possible. It's possible that what Jesus was telling them is, listen, if you believe that I am who God says I am, if you believe that when God says to listen to me, you're going to start listening to me, if you believe, then your life will show it. Your life will demonstrate it. And this text, again, I keep talking about how all the different versions of this story are the same across the three versions. Same thing. The text immediately follows where Jesus starts talking about the cost of discipleship. And especially in the Luke version, Jesus talks about how it's hard to follow Jesus. It's going to cost us something. He goes on, he talks about, the disciples talk about who's going to be the greatest, and Jesus kind of reminds them. And then he has that famous quote where he says, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. It comes immediately after the Transfiguration, right? And that one really, really tough passage where Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead. It's the end of Luke 9. It's right after the Transfiguration. In fact, Jesus says in this same passage, no one puts the famous passage of no one who puts their hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Jesus kind of says, like, look, if you answer this question in the affirmative, if you say you believe that I am the Son of God, if you believe and are going to follow me, then the way that you live your life, it will change. It will be impacted by it. Even in the Matthew version, Matthew has the section about moving mountains. And of course, that's a metaphorical mountain about a story about a literal mountain while we're talking about a metaphorical mountain in our life. And that was a little too meta for me. So we don't have a sermon on our faith moving mountains, but that's in this same story on Tabor. If we have a little tiny bit of faith, big things can happen. What we believe about Jesus impacts our life. Peter, he declares his belief in Jesus before the Transfiguration. But we all know that when the rubber meets the road, when things got tough, he kind of cut and run. And that's because talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. It's easy to say, yeah, I believe this or that or the other thing. Yeah. Talk is cheap. But our lives demonstrate something. This week we've been talking a lot, or people have had a lot on their minds about, politics and the election. And I posted this week this picture of myself encouraging people to vote. And I went and voted. This way I dropped my ballot in the mailbox. Important to vote. And, we've had political debates this week. And I don't know about you, but when I hear political debates, or when I hear about political debates, I can't help but think how it's easy to promise stuff. It's easy to talk about your hopes and your plans and your guarantees. It's easy for candidates to give tantalizing offers. It's easy. Talk is cheap. But it's hard to follow it up. It's hard to actually let it influence our lives. And it's true of politics, and it's true of following Jesus. Just like Brian said in his testimony, if we believe that Jesus is who he says he is, then the way that we live, the way that we experience the world right now will shift. The mystery of the Transfiguration is the core of all of Christianity. God became like us. That's what Peter sees in that moment. God became like us so that we might become a little bit more like God. And that's what Peter eventually experiences. So here's what I want to close today, our sermon time together. Every single person, well, maybe just about, maybe some people don't have the good luck of getting faced with this question, but we all who are listening today, we're being faced with this question. Who do you say Jesus is? How do you respond to the Transfiguration, whether in the story in the scriptures or in the moments in our lives where God gets close? And the truth is that I think we'll all answer that question with a little bit of nuance, and we all might shift a little bit over time, and some of us might be at different places as we grow. But something that's true for every single one of us is that our actions, when it comes down to it, our actions will reveal our underlying beliefs about Jesus. And so the question I want to leave you with today is, how do your actions, how does your life as it's currently constructed, how does your life answer the question, who do you say Jesus is? How do your habits, your choices and your behaviors and your thoughts, what do they say about who you believe Jesus is? And then maybe a secondary question is, if you were to lean a little more heavily into Jesus being the Messiah, if you were to lean a little more heavily into God's declaration, listen to this person who is the Son of God. If you were to lean a little bit more into that and believe that a little bit more fully, how would it change the way that your life lives right now? And maybe there's some options, and I actually have some options here for you. Maybe for you, kind of thinking more deeply and kind of getting more clarity about who Jesus is for you. Maybe for you, you need a way of ratifying that. A lot of times in Christianity or in religion, we need ways of putting flesh on stuff. And so we put ritual around it. We do things like we get baptized, for example. So for you, you may need to ratify that decision. For you, you may be answering, yes, Jesus is Lord. And for you, you may need to put kind of a stamp on that by going through an experience like baptism, or have some kind of formal thing where you make that official. For you, it may mean that the implication for you is that you got to do some more work. You got to do some more studying. You got to do some more digging. You got to do some more reading of texts and stories like this. If you want some commentaries, I'm a big fan of commentaries. I could recommend you all sorts of things that you could read. But for some of us, the way that we answer this question, who is Jesus, it's going to lean us into more discovery, more learning, more exploring. For some of us, we're going to look at our lives and we're going to see patterns that don't align. For some of us, we're going to think to ourselves today, yes, I believe that Jesus is Lord. And then we're going to see the way we've been speaking to our kids at home, or the way we've been relating to the boss or the company, or the way we haven't quite been showing up in the way that we are. For some of us, we're gonna look at certain patterns or behaviors or paths that are happening in our lives that don't align with who we see and think Jesus to be. And finally, for some of us, we're going to make new commitments. We're going to say, Jesus is Lord, therefore I am going to be more generous. Jesus is Lord, therefore I am going to receive and give more grace. I'm going to forgive more. I'm going to forgive myself more. I'm going to make space. I'm going to give myself time to grow. For some of us, we're going to say Jesus is Lord. Therefore, I'm going to step out into my purpose and my calling in life. I'm going to take a risk. I don't know what it is, but for some of us, our conclusions about who Jesus is and what his identity is, it's going to lead us into new commitments. What is it for you? This story of the Transfiguration, it's all about who Jesus is, but it drives to how we live our lives right now. Let's sing our closing song together, and I'll be back with you to pray in just a moment. All right, we are back, and the first segment, or if it's the second segment, I never really know, but on my sheet it's labeled second, but the next segment of the show after we roll the sermon is always called Microphone Therapist, and it's this part of the show where I kind of process and unload and share with you a little bit about how I felt about this sermon. It may be a surprise to some of you, but sometimes preachers get up there and preach, and they know it was a dud, they know that it didn't work, and a lot of times they feel bad about it, especially if they care about their work. If they care about the message especially. So there's a time where I get to share. It's just, hey, this is what I thought. This is the good parts. This is the bad parts. This is stuff that I liked, the stuff that I didn't like, and maybe even how I felt about it while it was happening. So a few observations I had. One of the things is that I just love the family of God piece. And if you've been with me at all on the podcast, we've talked about this family of God concept, and we went through a sermon series at the beginning of 2020, the Family of God series. And I love this idea, especially for my congregation here in Redlands, because we really are and are trying to be a family that is inclusive of all people. It's inclusive of people that have different sorts of lifestyles and different sorts of belief. And, I think that there are challenges ahead. And there, of course, are challenges in the past in terms of how we look after and accommodate folks and take care of people that have divergent viewpoints or divergent choices or whatever. But that's how families work. They stick together, even when people make mistakes or even when they live in a way that's different from the prevailing family culture. And so I love this idea that people are in all different steps. And if you listen to the sermon, that there's a point or a part of it where I was talking about how this transfiguration thing, Peter was in one place and the three disciples that were up on the mountain, or the other two that were up on the mountain with Jesus, they were in another place, and the disciples that were down the hill, they were in another place yet. And yet this experience of the transfiguration, it all caught them at different moments in their development, but it all did something for each of them. And I love the idea that a church community might be a place that can make space for people that are at all different steps of belief and non-belief even. Like, what would that be like to make space for someone who's not even sure if really God exists, or maybe not even sure if they want to follow Jesus? Can we make space for someone who's at that point of faith development? And then what about someone who's, given their lives to God and they've served God and served the church for 70 years? Can we make space for both of those people at the same time? To me as a pastor, that's an incredibly exciting challenge, and it's something that I love that I get to be a part of, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And, so I really liked sharing that kind of idea, because I think just philosophically there's sort of a leadership, influence, visionary piece to it, and it's always good to add that kind of stuff into sermons. But also I just think it's clear and it's super cool, and I love when that idea or concept shows up in stories, and I can sort of bring it out. Look, there's folks that are all over the place, and Jesus makes space for them, and he does things that help each of them in their own way, and maybe we as the church could do something similar too. So that's the first part of Microphone Therapist. The ending, in contrast, I didn't really care for. I thought it was clunky. And I kind of knew emotionally what I was trying to do with it, but in terms of the execution, I feel like it wasn't super, super well, just developed or thought out. And I also thought that there was another clunky part a little bit earlier where I was talking about the cost of discipleship. It was at the end of part 3, and I was kind of sort of trying to piggyback a little bit on the closing ideas of each of the accounts of the Transfiguration. And I kind of had these different quotes from different authors, and it just wasn't super tight. So I wasn't thrilled with how that was. But like I said in the introduction, I really liked that concept of how our present actions and attitudes and behaviors say something about our actual belief systems. It's sort of like the idea of values, organizational values. There's the hidden ones and the stated ones and the unrecognized one, all these different ones, right? Sort of that sort of thing. Our actions and behaviors and the way that we live our lives, it says something about what we believe, regardless of what we say about what we believe. And then likewise, on the other hand, if we say we believe X, Y, or Z, that often does translate into a change of way of living. If we say, listen, I'm committing myself to Jesus, I'm going to put my trust in Jesus, I would expect, and what I've seen most frequently in people, is that when people make those commitments, their lives shift with them. And, they may not have like a super crazy, transformation and everything changes, but if you give your life to Jesus and commit to following him, there should be some impact on the way that you live. And that's not easy. It's hard. But I think if I had to go back to it, if I did the ending again, I may end with that concept instead of kind of the altar call sort of thing I did. I almost feel like it ended up being a little bit redundant, and it just there it was. I liked the voting box to move on. I liked the voting box illustration. I liked. It was sort of an opportunity to invoke, or at least, name politics, which is a huge thing in our cultural conversation right now, while also not like being partisan or talking about what party I voted for, or what candidate I voted for, or whatever, but just to kind of name the concept. And I always, and of course, I have opinions about political issues, and I have opinions about political systems and about candidates and so on. I have opinions. I voted a certain way, and but I don't feel like the pulpit is the place, especially to name partisan things, and I think the pulpit is much better a place to talk about principle. And if those principles happen to confront a political party that is in power or a political party that's not in power, then that's how it is. And the fact of the matter is that talk is indeed cheap, and we see that we've seen that for decades. Like I've lived through the Reagan and Bush 1 and Clinton, and then Bush 2, and then Obama, and now the Trump administration. And in every single one of them, the candidates promise stuff, and talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. Some of them pull through on what they said they were going to do for the country's good and for the country's bad. And sometimes the candidates don't pull through on what they say they're going to do, again, for the country's good and for the country's bad. So I liked that. There's sort of a tightrope there in walking through political stuff when you're preaching, and I feel like that kind of held true. I feel like I was able to speak sort of around the subject while at the same time not getting myself into too much trouble, and that makes me feel good. Finally, for Microphone Therapist, if I had the thing to do over again, I would. This sermon was not very kid friendly. It wasn't very adolescent friendly, I don't feel like, and it certainly wasn't very kid friendly. And that was something that I think that I did well on the last sermon, even though I mentioned that I wasn't super pleased with how the popcorn thing went, but at least there was an effort there. But this time it was maybe even glaringly missing. So, that's something that I would wish to fix. And I'm going to try to fix that this week. So there you go. That's how I felt about it. Largely good. Some stuff that wasn't my favorite. But I liked how it turned out. I mean, Zoom, as always, is a challenging place to preach. And we're finding that more and more of our church members, even though we have a live service on Zoom, more and more of our church members are not engaging their cameras, or they're just watching offline. And so, I mean, that's fine. I totally get it. It's harder as a preacher because I don't have that, interaction and response and so on. So anyway, so there you go. There's Microphone Therapist. All right, we're going to do a section now called Killing Your Darlings. Killing Your Darlings. It's a phrase from English, from writing. And it's the idea that in order for your work to be its very best, you got to take out stuff that maybe sometimes you love. And, the first darling that was killed is not one that was fully killed off. Maybe it was just maimed, because I did mention this in the sermon, this idea. Well, actually, no, the first one I did not. There's an article I read that I really, really liked, and it's from Christian Century. It's called What Preachers Get Wrong About and What Peter Gets Right About the Transfiguration. And he kind of gives a critique of the common trope of sort of criticizing Peter and his, impulse to set up those monuments on top of the Mount of Transfiguration. And the author essentially asks, why didn't Jesus correct Peter for his impulse? Jesus doesn't respond to it at all. He just kind of sidesteps it and talks about something else. But if Peter's temptation to sort of, make these monuments and to worship Jesus and whatever, if that's such a significant temptation, then why didn't Jesus correct him, And this author in this article wrote, and this is something I was surprised by, and I have to admit, I haven't gone back and studied all the details, but he said here on this mountaintop, it's the only instance in all of the Gospels where Jesus, doesn't give a response to something that someone has said to him. So Peter says this thing, and Jesus doesn't respond at all. He doesn't tell them no. He doesn't criticize him. He doesn't yell at him. None of those things. He doesn't do that at all. He doesn't respond. And so the author sort of says, I wonder, is the reason that Jesus doesn't respond is because Peter got something right there. Peter may not totally appreciate what he's saying, but he got something right there. And what this author says is that gazing upon Christ, who is charged with uncreated light of God, is actually a good thing. In fact, gazing upon Christ and worshiping Jesus is the essence of discipleship, this author says. And the author goes on to say, God became like us, and that's what Peter sees, so that we might become like God. And that's what Peter eventually learns. It's really a profound idea. And the author goes on to say that what Peter gets wrong is that it's good to be there adoring Christ, but the wrong part is including 3 tabernacles. One for Elijah, one for Moses, and instead it would be just Jesus. But I thought it was a really interesting take. It's not something that I've really thought of before, and I'm always up for vindicating people who are criticized with knee-jerk judgment. So I'm up for the challenge here. But I think that in a way, Peter castigating Peter is sort of low-hanging fruit in this story, because he's doing sort of what religious people stereotypically do, which is to memorialize a spiritual experience that is ineffable, like the Transfiguration. It's this theophany, this experience where all of a sudden the distance between humanity and God gets thin, and the tendency of religious people is to take those transcendent, crazy spiritual experiences that are mystical and unexplainable, and then try to memorialize them and control them. And I'm sorry if that sounds really kind of judgmental and terrible. I'm a religious person, and I see great value in being a part of a religious community and practicing religion. But I'm also a realist, and that's what religions tend to do. We memorialize and kind of use that for control. And so I think it's that critique of Peter. There's some smoke or fire there. But there may be something more to the story. And so this whole kind of thought process and stuff, I really thought it was interesting, but it was kind of like an appendix on the sermon. It was just this little, sticking off the side and didn't really connect to anything else. So it got cut. There was this whole piece that I read from N.T. Wright, the great New Testament scholar, who talked about how just as the story of the Mount of Transfiguration is in parallel to the Mount Sinai narrative, which I talked about in the sermon, and how important that is to understanding the Transfiguration. Well, he says, well, just in a very similar way, it stands in sort of oppositional parallel to the crucifixion story, which is interesting. It has very similar elements, but instead of being in parallel, they're like an opposite. And I don't have all the notes right in front of me at the moment. Maybe I should pull those up and kind of look at them for a second, because I think what N.T. Wright writes about is really telling. It's sort of this preview of what's yet to come in Jesus' life, and it signals something new and different. So like in the Transfiguration and in Sinai, there's a mountain and a hill. I named those 7 things. Like there's the mountain and the hill, there's the shining white clothes, there's the Moses and Elijah flanking, there's the bright cloud, Peter blurts out wonder and amazement, and then the voice of God in affirmation. Well, on the cross, it's the opposite of each of those. There's a hill, Golgotha. It's not a high mountain, it's a hill. So maybe not the opposite, I guess, a valley. But Golgotha, I think, is pretty close to the valley of Hinnom, which is a valley. But far from being in glowing white clothes, Jesus was stripped naked in shame. Instead of being flanked by Moses and Elijah on the cross, Jesus was flanked by thieves and zealots. The Transfiguration has this cloud that envelops, but in the wake of the cross, there's darkness, right? Peter gives his affirmation of who Jesus is, but in the story of the cross, Peter is absent and silent. And likewise, in the Transfiguration, God speaks his affirmation over Jesus, but in the cross, God is silent. And it's only Peter, these pagan, it's only these pagan soldiers, these Roman soldiers, who affirm Jesus' identity. What a contrast. And N.T. Wright says, the mountaintop explains the hilltop. The word to the disciples then is just as much as the word to us today. If you want to find the way to God, and I did say this, if you want to find the way to God, if you want to find the way to God, if you want to find the way to the promised land, if you want to find the way to salvation, you must listen to Jesus. And I found that a powerful observation and metaphor. And if I had maybe another 10 minutes, I probably would have pulled that one in. Finally, there was a quote by this author, Marilyn Robinson. I was at Walla Walla University at the church, and we had Marilyn Robinson, who's a great author and novelist and storyteller, come tell the congregation some stories. And that was a wonderful, wonderful Sabbath. I really enjoyed hearing from her. And I had this quote. I was doing a lot of the design work for the church, and so we had this quote from her on the front of the bulletin, and it says, Wherever you turn your eyes, the world can shine like the Transfiguration. You don't have to bring a thing to it except a little willingness to see. And I love that concept of seeing anew, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. The next segment of the program is Wisdom is the Act of Thinking Something Stupid and Not Saying It. It's the segment that has the longest title, and it's also the one about applied wisdom. What did I learn about preaching, about the craft of preaching this week? What's something I learned, or what's something I applied? What's the process of putting these things together? And one of the principles that I used was that just like you can, it's okay to glean from and summarize someone's idea and to share it in your own words in one sentence, and not go through multiple quotes from where you got it from. It's okay to do that. In fact, maybe it's good. But it's also good to be honest about your sources. And so here, on Behind the Sermon, as I indicate sometimes when I'm preaching, you got to come on and listen so that you know sort of what's going on behind the scenes and where this stuff comes from. So that idea about seeing, right? We ended the last segment talking about seeing. I love that idea, and asking the question, who was really transfigured in this story? Who was really changed? And I love that sort of postulation that it was Peter and the disciples who were changed. It was how they were seen was changed, perhaps more than he himself. And that comes from Gregory of Palamas, a 14th century Orthodox theologian, who writes, Christ is transfigured not by putting on some quality that he did not possess previously, nor by changing into something that he never was before, but by revealing to the disciples who he truly was, in opening their eyes and giving sight to those who were blind. Oh, there is so much there. While remaining identical to what he had been before, he appeared to the disciples in his splendor. He indeed was true life. David Bentley Hart, another theologian, an Orthodox theologian, who's also an apologist and just a brilliant writer. I recommend you reading some of his stuff, David Bentley Hart. He proposes creation as a manifestation of God's infinite luminosity when he calls the agile radiance of the Spirit. And we see this radiance not by looking away from the world, but by looking more deeply into it, and kind of leading away from that through the Transfiguration we see Jesus differently, and therefore we see the world differently. And I love that concept. And, that may have been a better place to end the sermon, I don't know, instead of the altar call sort of thing, but how we see the world differently. And, at least for me, I don't know about for you, but when I read the word, and this is kind of the second part of wisdom, and that's kind of just about incendiary stuff. When I read the word transfigure, I can't help but hear the word transgender to begin with, and of course, transgender is a buzzword in our culture, and perhaps amongst some of my listeners who are many of whom are Christians, and it kind of tends to be that there are some judgmentalism around, or maybe even misunderstanding about the concept of transgender. But if you're not familiar, transgender is this idea in medicine and in science that sometimes people have an internal sense of gender that doesn't align with their physical sex, or in some cases, there's just a lack of alignment between their assigned gender and the rigid gender rules of society. And so I thought about sort of bringing that in, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought about I would hate to hurt someone's feelings or make an offense by making light of this topic, because I know that people who struggle with thoughts regarding being transgender, it's painful. I know that transgender folks have a much higher rate of suicide than the general population. So I certainly wouldn't want to joke about it as a way of getting into the sermon, because it's sort of like like I said, it's sort of a word association thing, where when I read the word transfigured, I think about transgendered, because they're sort of, similar ideas, changing form or changing body, or, different body or whatever. And so it would kind of be, the place where it would be used in a sermon is at the very beginning, right? As an entry point, unless a preacher was going to use a concept like that to, condemn transgender folks, which is not something that I would do. So it wouldn't fit later in the sermon either. So anyway, it just ended up feeling like it was too incendiary to really bring it in. And, I think that happens a lot of times in sermons, and that's that, it's possible to bring something in. It's possible to talk about a subject, but the risk of losing people and not being able to communicate to them the main idea of what God has put on your heart to bring, sometimes it becomes not worth it. And so if you have this burning judgment about, for example, trans people, or if you're kind of more like me, who has a burning desire to be inclusive of all people and try to make space for everyone, speaking of the what we spoke about earlier, if you're like me, I think it can go both ways. You could lose people who have maybe, people in their family or something that are transgender, or who have experience with that, or who are themselves that way. You could lose them by making them feel judged. And then on the other end of the spectrum, by being, too accepting or whatever, especially as a preacher, or being, not being strident enough, or not taking a stand or something. At the same time, you get other people to be like, is that person are they loving too much? And, and then they miss the whole point of the sermon. And so, I think it's something that's important to think about. And you've heard me talk about this before, incendiary stuff. Sometimes you got to talk about the hard things, and you got to talk about the hard topics. But, this sermon wasn't about gender identity. It wasn't about sexuality. It wasn't about any of the things that sometimes go with those or that are sort of related to those conversations around gender. It wasn't about that. And so that was one of the things that got cut out. Wisdom is the act of thinking something stupid and not saying it. We are rounding the bases on the close of the program. We have just a couple of segments left. We're going to do one called Intent versus Impact, and this is the question and answer segment, the suggestions, the input, feedback I've received. I got some kind feedback from one of our elders this afternoon in the church office, and that's always sweet to hear. Hey, your sermon, it touched me. It worked for me. It was helpful. And that's what I want to do. I try to preach in ways that are helpful to me, and I know for me, this sermon was helpful. And doing the recording and doing this behind the sermon is always helpful as well. It's a little bit therapeutic. So, but it's always a beautiful thing to receive your feedback. But if you would be willing to give some feedback, even in the form of a review, write a review. Give me some tips, even if it's not a 5-star. Actually, no. I would be inclined, in the words of Bomani Jones, to assume that you are a hater if you do not give me 5 stars. But man, I would love to have your review on iTunes or Spotify. I hope other people it will help other people find the show. But if you have a question about preaching, or you have a question about the sermon, or you have a question about the process or how to do it, or maybe you're working on a sermon yourself and you want some input, man, shoot me an email. I would love to talk about it on a microphone by myself in my office, and you can listen to it later. So there you go. There's intent versus impact. And the final segment of the show is called That'll Preach. And it's all about homiletical bias and how preachers move through the world, and we're always absorbing things and looking at situations for how can I use that in a sermon? How can I take advantage of that? How can I pull that into my teaching? And of course, this week I had a prime example, and that's when the Lakers won their 17th NBA title. Yes. And of course, I'm a Lakers fan. And if you watch some of our programming, you know that me and my friend here at the church, Obed, we're Lakers people, and we're excited to watch the absolute blowout in Game 6 of the 2020 NBA Finals in the bubble. And the Lakers took their title. And, the next day I like to listen to sports talk shows. It's kind of nerdy, but I kind of like to listen to them. It's sort of like a soap opera drama kind of thing. And one of the guys I like to listen to is a guy named Bill Simmons, and he's from Boston. He's from Massachusetts, and he's an unapologetic fan of the Boston Bruins and the Boston Red Sox and the New England Patriots and the Boston Celtics. Ick. And of course, I'm a Lakers fan, and I didn't live long enough to, I was a fan of the Lakers when Kobe first got drafted, and then when Shaquille O'Neal made it to the Lakers for his stint back when he was in his prime, and Kobe and Shaq did their three-peat, and then a little bit later, Kobe and Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom and the whole crew, they won a couple more titles, and I'm just a big fan of the Lakers all through there. And then, of course, a fan as well through those thin years. And then we're back this year. We were back, and we won the champ. So anyway, getting sidetracked, Bill Simmons was very eagerly congratulating the Lakers for their 12th title, not their 17th, their 12th title, because 5 of those titles were won by the Minneapolis Lakers, and he says that they should not count. And it's just, like hilarious and petty and ridiculous, and the things that fans do to try to make themselves feel superior. And, I don't know how I'll use that in a sermon, but I'm going to use it. And when I heard Bill Simmons talking like that, I thought to myself, that'll preach. So, hey folks, thanks so much for joining me on the program. Thanks for listening and for sharing and for giving your comments and for your encouragement and even for your suggestions and critiques that are constructive. I appreciate those. Next week, we will be back on the program with the Mount of Olives, the Olivet Discourse, and we're going to be talking a little bit about injustice, how to deal with injustice in the world that we live in, which is, of course, a huge conversation in our country right now. So thanks again for sharing and for listening in. Man, if you see me share the show on social media, I would love it if you would offer a signal boost. Share it, like it, comment on it, leave a rating and review. You can learn more about me at chrislowen.com or at behindthesermon.com. Blessings, friends. May you know that you are enough exactly as you are. God made you. He loves you. We all got those rough edges here and there, and God loves those too. And He's not going to leave us in that place. He's pulling us forward so that we can be the best possible version of ourselves. May you know that there's a place for you to give and to love and to be in this world. Thanks, friends.